In 1944, the Allies carried out a successful invasion of Hitler's so-called Fortress Europe. It had been expected by the Germans, for the massive build-up of forces in Britain could not be hidden from their intelligence services. Both sides knew that the crucial phase would be the securement of a substantial bridgehead, and both sides knew that surprise and the unexpected would have considerable bearing on the outcome. It was a question of secrets. The paramount Allied secret for the defenders was where?
The intention was to make landings along the strip of coast between the mouth of the Orne River and the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula, to cut off the peninsula and to secure Cherbourg as a supply port.
Knowing the landing area would allow the concentration of available resources to throw the invaders back into the sea. At the end of 1943, Hitler appointed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to command the Atlantic war defenses. This talented leader lost no time in making improvements. There were some 42 army divisions at his disposal in the west, sufficient to repulse the heaviest assault if the precise area of the landings was known. But it was not, and Rommel had to spread his troops and armor from the northern tip of Holland all the way to the Cherbourg Peninsula. The most likely place for a landing was the Pas de Calais because of its proximity to England. And the Allies would need to take ports, possibly Boulogne, Calais, or Dunkirk. All things considered, an overwhelming assault across the Straits of Dover was the most logical scenario for invasion. The Allies' planners reasoned this would be their enemy's expectation and set out to encourage him and maintain the secret of their true intentions. The first step was the subterfuge of spreading false information and undertaking other enterprises that might confirm the Pas de Calais as the invasion place. The main deception plans were conducted under the code name Fortitude. Fortitude North was aimed at making the Germans think Allied forces were being assembled in Scotland for an invasion of Norway, thus hopefully causing them to keep several army divisions deployed in that country. Fortitude South was the main ploy, to convince the enemy that the Pas de Calais was where the landings would be made. There were many enterprises under Fortitude, all carefully coordinated. The principal organization involved in deception operations for Overlord was our force, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways.
The object of any deception plan was not to make the enemy think something, but to do something. And that is the fundamental of all deception. What you're doing is to feeding tiny bits, never big bits, into the enemy intelligence system. So you've got your scenario, what we used to call a story, and so you wrote your little story, about 5 lines, that's all. And then you fed bits of information through, and you watched all those bits of information going. Now which one he picked up, it didn't matter. But if he picks up one here and one there, they match. And then what's being done from London, through the press, through all sorts of weird things, and your agents, of course, all fits in with that.
While maintaining a spread of bomber attacks on coastal defenses from the Netherlands to Brittany, the Allied air forces put a greater weight into those around the Pas de Calais. The destruction of coastal radar by air attack was similarly planned and executed. Likewise, reconnaissance aircraft regularly photographed 300 miles of coastline, but put in more activity around the Boulogne to Dunkirk area. Although most Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over southern England were intercepted, some evaded RAF fighters over Kent and returned with evidence of a build-up of aircraft on advanced landing grounds, landing craft in ports, and vast military camps. Many of these installations were fake, as were guns, tanks, and vehicles. Some of the tanks and vehicles were made by the Dunlop Rubber Company. They were inflated for display, and when deflated could be easily moved to another site. Modelled on the American Sherman, they were difficult to tell from the real thing at 100 yards.
These were brought to us intact. They were there. All they had to be done was to be blown up. In other words, they were like a great big inner tube, and you just got a foot pump on them and blew them up.
We plugged in and started blowing this thing up, and it looked like a giant sausage to start with, and then the end became square at one of the other ends. And then we suddenly decided that was a gun barrel, a 75mm imitation gun barrel, and the square part was a breech.
They were in two parts. There was the main body of the tank, and then there was the turret, which went on separately. They could be lifted by 4 men quite easily. I should think you'd probably get about 30 to 35 tanks on a 3-ton lorry.
The tank patrol would usually be 6 tanks, and they spread out and cover quite an area, so you wouldn't want to put 25, 30, 40 tanks up because that would cause suspicion, because you'd never amalgamate and get cluster tanks like that because there's such a target, you see. The Sherman tank was all one piece, and that gradually flipped out and took shape. We didn't know what that was, blowing it up, and that was in 4 compartments. We had it blown up in 4 different sections, and the idea of that was that when it got to the real thing over there and Jerry come over and had a look at it, if he decided it was a tank, was going to have a go at it, if it was all in one, you appreciate, and the splatters the whole lot would collapse. But in 4 sections, you've got a good chance of it staying upright, and he's still fooled by it.
Well, this is a 1 squadron of tanks in harbour. There is a wood, and here is a wood. The road entrance is there, and you can see that I've made some marks here showing how they go into harbour. They go up into harbour here, and then another lot would go into harbour here, and then across there, and the squadron echelon would be round there. And then there's the fitter's truck, which would be stuck here. Of course, these are all rubber tanks.
One of the things we discovered early was, although the tanks were cleverly painted, nuts and bolts, now when you get the real thing, if you put the tank up and the sun's over there, for instance, and there's no shadow, there should be a shadow this side of the nut, of course, and whatever, handles protruding. So shadows had to be painted. They had to be added on by painters of another part of the regiment. Now, as the sun moves about, if there's any, by the way, so you've got to move your tank round to keep that shadow going.
They would all be the inflatable vehicles. All of these would be inflatable, except, of course, our unit vehicles, which we would have to put as part of these, our own unit. And, of course, the beauty of that is that we could use our own vehicles to run to and fro, making the marks of vehicles going into position.
Sham landing craft were assembled on many of the estuaries in the south and southeast during darkness, and by daylight were tethered in the water. They were known as big bobs.
They were full-size craft. They floated on oil drums. The framework was very light tubular scaffolding, bolted together, and it was all done to a pattern. And then round the outside was a coating of canvas, and this canvas painted, the painting to match that of a landing craft. And then on the top we put a funnel and I suppose you call it a cabin. Well, on one occasion I was motoring by Buxter's Heart. I saw some things floating in the deck, and honestly I couldn't tell them from the real thing, and I was half a mile away. The chief problem was security. You see, we were frightfully careful that nobody knew what we were doing. You see, the whole scheme was to persuade the Germans that we were bringing troops from Cornwall to Sussex.
Among all the mock-ups were real airfields with real aircraft, camps with real troops and tanks. There was a concentration of radio traffic in the southeast of England, much false, some authentic.
There were 7 trucks, okay? An exercise or a job could be the use of 1 truck or 4 or 5, whatever was required. And each truck would have reels of wire recordings, and the operators would have scripts with times on them as well. They were timed. And a truck would, at his given moment, start transmitting, and at the end of the transmission, he would stop. And if this was a question to another station, that station would send an answer.
There were 2 reels affixed to the machine, shall I call it, with very, very fine wire, like a cotton. And we were told in the instruction we had that they were highly magnetized and that they would record by means of a beep system any Morse code.
It would be normal, mundane information that operators would be asked to send out. It might be asking for reinforcements, it might be asking for ammunition supplies, it might be all kinds of things.
If the wire broke and we retrieved the 2 broken ends, if we tied a reef knot, that's I think it is a reef knot, where you have a centre and you can pull it tight together, and you could fuse that knot by the end of a lighted cigarette, and then blow on it to cool it down, and then clip off the edges and carry on.
Now, the answer may come from one or any other vehicle because it's directed from a headquarters station, as it were, to outstations. So he might be speaking to any one of 3 or 4. And as one transmission went out, it was followed by the response or another to headquarters, and so the traffic would flow interlocked, one with the other, as a network, putting out the kind of transmissions that you would expect from the unit that they were representing. If it was an armoured corps, you would have the kind of information that tank commanders would be asking each other. If it was artillery, it was what gunnery officers would be talking to and about to each other. And it was done in this way.
But of course we had to vary the pitch and the volume, because although the vehicle was, my vehicle was here, and the one I was broadcasting to was on the other end of this field here, we had to make it do that we were miles and miles away, and so we had to vary the volume to suit the script. Well, the script told us anyway.
6 trucks would be working, and not one of them would know what the other was doing, because it was secret.
While these elaborate deceptions were intended to give the impression of a vast build-up of forces in Kent and Essex, at the same time they were conducted in such a way as to suggest that preparations were in an early stage, and that the planned invasion could not take place until the late summer of 1944. An important part of Fortitude was the use of enemy agents who had been apprehended and turned to work for the Allied cause. They were cleverly cultivated to inform their masters of the troop concentrations in Kent and Essex, where General Patton was supposedly waiting with an army group. Perhaps the most successful element of Fortitude was Agent Garbo's advice to his German controller soon after the Normandy landings had taken place, stating that this was simply a large-scale diversion and that the main invasion would be in the Pas-de-Calais. This was believed, and for a few weeks Hitler kept several divisions, including panzers, in that area. A major aid to the success of Fortitude was Ultra, the German wireless ciphers regularly decoded by the organization at Bletchley Park.
We had a special section set up looking at all the German signals for anything that could bear on what we had now been told about the deception program.
And it was through Bletchley Park that signs of success were forthcoming.
They began by assuming the landings would be in France. Nothing could change that. Fortitude kept them guessing as to where it would be, anywhere between Calais and Bordeaux. They finally narrowed it down to being anywhere between Calais and the Cotentin Cherbourg Peninsula. But they always thought it would be followed, if it was anywhere else, it would be followed by the Pas-de-Calais. And one of the reasons why they believed that was that one of the parts of the deception was to lead them to think that the Allies had over 80 divisions in the United Kingdom, which was more than twice what we had got, you see. So whenever we'd landed 20 divisions, they thought we got another 60 left. So that was the main force, and that kept them guessing till after, well after the landings were made.
Bletchley Park was a top-secret establishment in a requisitioned mansion. Likewise, many secret headquarters of organizations committed to the Normandy invasion were located in country mansions. The Allied naval commander for the Normandy invasion, Operation Neptune, established his headquarters in Southwark House near Portsmouth, and this also became the forward headquarters for the land force commander, General Montgomery, who moved his mobile office into the grounds. It was here, on the 5th of June, that General Eisenhower faced the delays through inclement weather and made his momentous decision to launch the invasion. There were some enemy secrets that could only be obtained through clandestine operations along the French coast. British commandos landed and brought back details of the beach defenses, allowing replica steel post, wire and cement structures to be constructed off Britain's west coast for engineer demolition teams to practice on. Enemy strongpoints, photographed from the air, were secretly reproduced in England so that troops tasked with assault of the real thing could have more realistic training. On the other side of the Channel, Rommel and his advisors were trying to hide the disposition and strength of their army formations. Extremely difficult amidst the hostile French population whose underground movements regularly reported to Britain. Some of these underground cells that had been identified by the Germans were allowed to function, deliberately being fed false information. However, there were limits to what the Germans could achieve in this direction. Measures to deceive were also an important part of the actual invasion operation. To make the enemy suspect the landings were coming in the Pas-de-Calais, on the night of the 5th of June, Operations Glimmer and Taxable were staged, involving 2 fake invasion forces. At sea, a small number of vessels simulated a vast number by noise and force radar signals. In the air, the radio countermeasures squadrons of the RAF and USAAF, using a transmitting device called Mandrel, and for the first time dropping a new type of window foil, simulated an aircraft stream of many hundreds, moving from England out towards the fake invasion areas. Yet another deception was Operation Titanic. This involved 4-man parties of SAS parachutists whose task it was to simulate the dropping of a large airborne force in selected areas away from the real Normandy landings. They were aided by Paragons, which were inflatable dummy parachutists dropped in fair numbers from the aircraft. Each was fitted with an explosive device which detonated on striking the ground. The SAS men had small gramophones which broadcast voice and battle noises. They also fired Very pistols and took other action to simulate battle noises. To further confound the enemy, at other locations, dummy parachutists known as Ruperts were released, and although about a quarter the size of the real thing, proved most effective. To improve their chances of success, the Allies had produced an array of secret equipment that ranged from the simple and inexpensive to the exceedingly complex and costly. The first paratroopers dropped at night would need some means of telling friend from foe in the darkness. Each American paratrooper was provided with a simple metal clicker, like that from a Christmas cracker. One click, answered with 2 clicks, was a friend. The British paratroopers had what they called a Bakelite duck, a plastic whistle that sounded like a duck's call. Among the lessons learned from the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942 was the need to get invading armour past defensive obstacles and off the landing beach as quickly as possible. Specialised armour was required and led to the recall of retired Major General Sir Percy Hobart, well known for his inventiveness. Given command of the 73rd Armoured Division, in remarkably short time, his team developed a whole family of specialised armour for seaborne landings. For clearing a path through beach mines, a Sherman tank was fitted with 2 beams extending out in front and supporting a driven flail of chains. In operation, the flail exploded the mines without impeding progress of the tank. This idea had been developed on older model tanks and perfected on the Sherman, which, thus modified, became known as the Crab.
The Crab was developed because we could retain the turret, the gun turret, with a 75mm gun and a coaxially mounted 300 Browning. We had to dispense, though, with the forward-firing Browning in the hull. It had a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, gunner and a wireless operator loader, and a driver and a co-driver. The co-driver originally fired the forward gun, but actually he wasn't able to do anything except pass prey and pass the ammunition up through the turret. My job was a tank commander, but I also was a troop commander. I had 5 tanks in the troop. This was more than the normal tank troop. And we practiced in teams with the Assault Royal Engineers, with their Churchill A1, Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers. We practiced first of all at Orford in East Anglia, where there were full-scale replicas built of parts of the Atlantic Wall, the great big wall itself, the concrete bunkers, the minefields, the wire entanglements, for which I might say the Crab was ideally suited because of these cutters on the end of the drum, which proved to be extremely useful. Now, the flail beats a path about 9 feet wide, which is not wide enough for practical purposes for another tank to follow through. So the idea was that you had at least 2 flails, possibly 3, in echelon, either to left or right of the front leading one, with the driver putting the near side track in the offside track mark of the tank in front. The thought of travelling at 1.5 miles an hour through a minefield, which is put there specifically to enable enemy anti-tank gunners to more easily engage a target, that is not a very happy-making thought. Bases in England were kept secret. In East Anglia, for instance, the civilian population had been moved out of a large area of this training area. We were within it, and there were guards, so you couldn't get in. When we moved on the roads with the Crabs, they were sheeted up with an enormous tarpaulin with just 2 holes cut, one for the driver and one for the commander. Not very pleasant for the rest of the crew. And in addition to that, the roller, the roller of the jib itself had to be sheeted up separately, so that even if the top tarpaulin were off, you couldn't see what was underneath, the chains in particular, and the wire cutters.
Wide tank traps and even rivers have been crossed with the aid of fascines carried on an AVRE-adapted Churchill.
Most of the specialised armour developed was on a Churchill, no longer a first-line tank. A device to carry and eject a large bundle of wood enabled tanks to cross deep trenches or craters. A detachable ramp placed on a Churchill enabled vehicles to surmount banks or sea walls. For wet or loose ground, bobbin tanks unreeled 100 yards of heavy matting road. For dealing with enemy pillboxes or strong points, a Churchill chassis fitted with a flamethrower was called a crocodile.
The crocodile was a very fearsome and also a very secret weapon at the time it was first introduced. It was a Churchill Mark 7 tank to which was attached a trailer. It was a flamethrower tank. The fuel for the flamethrower was contained in the trailer, 400 gallons of fuel that's rather like what was later called napalm, and that was forced forward by some high-pressure nitrogen in the trailer. In the tank, close to the driver, was the flame gunner. When he pressed the flame gun trigger, a rod of burning fuel was projected from the front of the tank up to a distance of about 100 yards, and it was composed of a very viscous fuel. When this hit any person, any object, it stuck to it and it continued to burn. You could not throw it off, and you might flame for up to 2 minutes. That was the total duration of the fuel. Before you went into action, it was necessary for the crew to get out of the tank, open the valves on 6 bottles of nitrogen in the trailer at the back. Then you waited a period for the pressure to build up in the tank containing the fuel. You then, with your safety devices still put off, you went into action, and as you approached the target, at a distance of about 100 yards, you gave the order as commander to the flame gunner to flame, and then the flame started to come out from the front. The original intention was that as the forces went up the beaches, the flamethrowers would be used against the concrete emplacements, the gun positions of the Germans. In fact, I think with the exception of one action when it was used like that, it was used almost entirely against much less conventional targets. In Normandy itself, we were flaming trenches, we were flaming dugouts, we were flaming just fields, anywhere where there was a German position, perhaps with an anti-tank gun or with a machine gun.
There were other adaptations of the Churchill, one sporting a short-barrel mortar and various turretless versions in a variety of beach recovery guises, with winches, cranes and bulldozer blades to cheat obstacles. Perhaps the most ingenious and, for the enemy, surprising of General Hobart's funnies, as they came to be called, were the tanks that swam. By installing a collapsible waterproofed canvas screen around the upper hull, the tank would float. An internal twin-shaft drive turned twin-screw propellers at the lower rear of the tank to propel it along at about 5 miles an hour. Training with these duplex drive Valentine and Sherman tanks, soon simply known as DDs, revealed their instability in rough seas. For when one started to sink, it went down like the proverbial lead balloon. DD crews had to be trained to use Davis escape equipment as supplied to submarine crews. Despite the bad weather and rough seas encountered on D-Day, DD tanks played an important part in giving armoured support during the initial landings. There were many other pieces of secret equipment to aid the invasion and facilitate the work which followed. Within hours of the bridgehead being established, construction commenced on the landing grounds from which aircraft would operate over the battle area. Both mud and summer dust had been anticipated. To overcome the latter, bituminous matting was laid by a special machine known as the sand licker. A lifeblood of Allied armies and air forces that landed on the continent was fuel and oil, the subject of another closely guarded secret. The cover name PLUTO was said to tell it all, being the initial letters of the project, Pipeline Under the Ocean. There were 2 parallel developments lest one should fail. HAIS flexible pipe was based on a process used in making submarine electric cable. The lead pipe, which formed the core, was armoured. First, with bituminous paper, cloth tape, and 4 layers of steel tape, each wound separately. Then jute cord and steel wire, and finally an outer skin. From the factory on the Thames, the pipe was coiled in the holds of the special cable-laying vessels, which were mostly adapted merchantmen. The apparatus used in laying the pipe was similar to that used for electric cable. Flanged connections were fitted to the ends of pipe lengths and bolted together to make leak-proof joints.
A cable would be attached to the end of the pipeline, pulled over a very large winch with a 9-foot drum. A turn around the winch, this 9-foot drum. When the drum turned, it pulled the cable from the tank and pushed it forward over the bow. A very large sheave or jockey wheel over the bow. The cable rolled over the jockey wheel in the bow, down to the water. So long as the drum turned, the cable would be pulled from the tank and pushed forward over the bow, while the ship steamed ahead on the cable at about 2 knots. So between the ship steaming on the cable, the drum turning, it was a continuous operation, laying it for the whole 22 miles. When we laid the experimental pipelines across Swansea Bay, that was a smaller pipe, the experimental pipe, and we used to ask for aircraft to fly across to look for oil slicks, rainbow patterns on the water, but we never had any leaks. It was successful. The ships, converted merchant ships, cargo ships, 10,000 ton ships, were called HMS Latimer, HMS Ridley. Bishop Latimer and Bishop Ridley, burnt at the stake in Oxford in 1555. Bishop Latimer said to Bishop Ridley, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out. Be of good cheer, brother. We shall this day kindle such a torch in England, as I trust in God shall never be extinguished." This, obviously, was the object of PLUTO, to light a torch, a beacon on the continent. That quotation was on a plaque on both ships, the Latimer and the Ridley. That was our war cry.
The second pipe type developed for PLUTO used 2 or 3 inch diameter mild steel pipe with 1/4 inch thick walls. Short lengths were welded together in a dockside factory to form 3/4 mile lengths. Each weld was machined to give a smooth join as the welded length was gradually pushed out of the factory onto holding racks. The pipe was flexible enough to be wound round a floating steel drum that resembled a massive cotton reel. This assembly was known as a conundrum. A 70-mile length of pipe could be wound round the drum, and in total the assembly weighed nearly 1,600 tons. Towed by a tug, the drum revolved when the pipe was being laid.
The other one was built like huge cotton reels, a steel pipe to carry water, because they thought the possibility of poisoned or contaminated water
lack of water, for whatever reason, they were going to lay freshwater pipes. We called them cotton reels. They were, in fact, huge cotton reels.
The secret pumping stations were installed on the coast of the Isle of Wight, concealed in a bogus golf clubhouse, ice cream parlour and hotel. A second pumping station was placed in a bomb-damaged holiday resort nearby. Another pumping station complex was built at Dungeness, using houses and bungalows for camouflage. Project Bambi called for 4 pipelines to be laid from the Isle of Wight to Normandy and be fully operational 18 days after D-Day.
We went on many exercises before D-Day, so the Germans never knew which was going to be the real one. But for weeks and weeks before D-Day, hundreds and hundreds of ships used to go downriver, out into the Channel and back, exercising and also confusing the Germans, no doubt. And we went in and out several times until the day of operations, and then it was for real. And the sky was black with aircraft, and the sea was black with ships. At last we could get down to it and do something. That was a good feeling, to be able to get started doing something.
But various setbacks ensued, and when pumping to Cherbourg eventually began, 2 lines were found to be defective, and the other 2 broke when working pressure was applied.
There was some made in America, and there was quite a celebration when it was loaded aboard one of America's mass-produced Liberty ships. Photographs and champagne and speeches. The ship set sail and broke its back.
Meanwhile, the Tombola project, 3,000 feet long pipelines from offshore tanker discharge points to storage at Port-au-Bassin, was proving highly successful. Dumbo, the second PLUTO route, was laid from Dungeness to Boulogne and came into operation early in December 1944. Eventually, Dumbo had 11 lines through which over 3,000 tons of petroleum products were pumped each day and proved very successful in operation.
We crew had hoped, after the war, to be able to buy this, salvage it, relay it to Ireland and pump the Guinness over. Needless to say, we didn't.
Tanks required fuel and ammunition. To supply these and all the other logistical requirements of an invading army rapidly increasing in strength, substantial port facilities were an immediate and critical requirement. The Germans knew this, and they had fortified all the major Channel ports, knowing that without a port the Allies' build-up could not be sustained. Thus, perhaps the greatest invasion secret of all was a transportable harbour which was assembled off the coast of Normandy. It was designed to last the 3 summer months, but half a century on, its massive components remain the most prominent relics of the Normandy invasion. Under the cover name Mulberry, work on a prefabricated harbour capable of handling 12,000 tons of cargo and landing 2,500 vehicles a day had begun in Britain less than a year before the Normandy invasion. The basic function of a harbour is to provide calm waters around quays. The sea swells were to be diminished first by lines of block ships, old vessels deliberately scuttled. A further calmer of the waves would be steel floats anchored in lines beyond the block ships. At the two harbour sites, some 150 giant hollow caissons, each made of steel and concrete, were to be towed across the channel and sunk to form the main protective breakwaters. Piers to the shore inside the protective ring were to float up and down with the tide. One Mulberry was to be placed at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer and the other at Arromanches. The plan was that both harbours would be assembled and in operation 2 weeks after D-Day. The construction, transport and erection of these artificial ports was a colossal undertaking. Over 1.5 million tons of concrete and steel were used, and some 40,000 construction workers involved at one time or another. The giant concrete caissons were in two sizes, weighing some 110 and 70 tons each. They were, in effect, large concrete boxes, sunk by filling with water. They were made by the simple but effective means of excavating a pit to the required dimensions close to a tidal estuary. A cladding mould was constructed in the pit, and when the caisson was completed, the ground was dug away between the pit and the water so that the caisson could be floated out. The caisson was then sunk in a location where it might appear to be an extension to an existing port installation if spotted by an enemy reconnaissance plane. The caisson rose when pumped dry and was ready to be towed to Normandy. Most of these caissons, codenamed Phoenix, were built around East Coast estuaries. The Mulberry block ships, codenamed Gooseberries, set out from Poole, England on the afternoon of D-Day and were sunk at 5 locations along the invasion beaches. Cross-shaped welded steel floats, bombardons, each about 150 feet long and displacing 2,000 cubic meters of water, were positioned to the west of each port site to form an approximate 3/4 mile long immediate breakwater. The first Phoenix caissons were taken out next day. When these reached Normandy, they were sunk in an arc around the two sites, and those with anti-aircraft guns soon equipped and manned. One of the most extraordinary commands of the Normandy invasion was that of a floating lump of concrete.
After we'd taken them round to Churchill Bill, or Dungeness rather, we also took some round to Churchill Bill, which is next to Portsmouth. And we were working up there, getting everything ready. We had to check all the Phoenixes to make sure there was a big box of tools on each one and so forth, which had to be checked. And also supply of emergency food and so forth. And there was a 2-gallon can of drinking water, and that's all. There were ships as far as one could see between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. You could walk across them almost. People were getting a bit fed up because there was no leave. We'd had no leave for quite a long time. And of course we didn't realise when D-Day would be. No one would tell us. Nevertheless, once we saw gliders and things going over the top in their hundreds, in fact the sky was thick with them and ships began to move, we knew that something was on. And we tied up to our first Phoenix, tug rather, and away we went. But of course it took us rather a long time because they were so huge, these caissons. I think they weighed somewhere about 6,000 to 7,000 tons. 60 foot wide, 60 foot high, 200 feet long. And they had a flat front. So 3 knots was about it. It took us the whole of that day, the night, and then part of the following day to get there. 2 of them were lost, of course, to E-boats with torpedoes. I noticed that in the dark, star shells were being fired, obviously by some of our ships, to light up the sea where they suspected E-boats might be. And on board this Phoenix, it was an able seaman in charge, 2 ordinary seamen and a signalman. There were also 2 soldiers, but they were really passengers.
Did you think you were going to get there to Arromanches?
I sometimes wondered, to be quite honest, especially on one occasion when the actual Phoenix or caisson was sinking. It was listing very badly. I put this down, quite honestly, to the workman, not the design of the thing. But I rather imagine that somebody fancied an extra bag of cement at home and shoved it over the wall, because we had a huge crack form in one of the walls and the water was pouring in. We had a pump on board run by petrol, which was quite honestly useless. But on the side, each side of the Phoenix was a huge concrete block. I think the design of that was for some sort of anchorage, although I never saw it used for that reason. And I decided to let one of these go to see if we could lighten it somewhat and get rid of the list, because it was like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And as I was in charge, I thought, well, I better go down and see what I can do about it. So I went down, and of course the Phoenix was leaning over me like that, 60 foot of concrete. And I thought, my God, if this thing comes over, I've had it. Anyway, my feet were in water, but I chiselled away, and my colleagues came down and gave me a hand because I couldn't do it on my own, and we cut it adrift. It didn't make very much difference, to be quite honest. So we clambered back on top, and I got onto the signaller and I said, get onto the tug, for God's sake, get a move on, we're sinking. And the tug certainly did put on a spurt. And we got there in time, and we got it in place, which I was very pleased about. As I say, we were 60 foot up on a piece of flat concrete. We had no protection whatsoever. If we were hit by anything, it would just go down like a stone. Strangely enough, I was an able seaman, and yet on that Phoenix, I was the captain, which suited me extremely well.
The sections of floating roadway for the piers, 5 under tow at a time, were also arriving. They were winched into position using steel cables to form a 480 feet long floating causeway. Then the rectangular floating pierheads, each of which had 4 40-ton steel spuds, were lowered by cable to the seabed to secure their position. Although the pierhead would be raised up and down by the tide, diesel engine-powered winches could tighten the cables to transfer more weight onto the spuds during bad weather. On the 14th of June, only 8 days after the initial landings, the first pier was in use at Mulberry A at Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. But 2 days later, the weather and rough seas checked construction and delivery of more components from England. The weather got steadily worse, and by the 19th it developed into a full-scale howling northeast gale, unprecedented for the time of year. Its ferocity was such that Mulberry A was wrecked. 20 of the 31 caissons then in place were damaged beyond repair. The piers were swept away, as were most of the other floating installations. Mulberry B at Arromanches did not suffer so cruelly, and while there was much damage to the floating sections, the Phoenix and Gooseberry breakwaters held up well. It was decided to abandon Mulberry A as a port and concentrate all efforts on Arromanches. Eventually, there were 7 floating pierheads, linked by 2 floating pier roads. Some sections of the roadway were telescopic, to extend or reduce its length as affected by the changes in tides. There were also 2 special piers with separate pierheads. The shorter barge pier to the west of the main piers handled all ordnance stores and dangerous cargoes, so that if hit by enemy action or through some accident there was an explosion, the main intake of the port would not be damaged. The other special pier to the east was constructed to handle LST deliveries. The LST craft carried vehicles, tanks, and heavy towed equipment. The vessel's 2 bow doors opened and a ramp was lowered so that the vehicles could be driven out. They were designed for delivery straight onto beaches, where unloading was usually delayed by tides. The LST pier usually allowed unloading to be completed within an hour, as compared with from 3 to 9 in beach operations. Moreover, 2 high-level ramps on the pierhead allowed light vehicles on the deck to be unloaded at the same time as the heavyweights through the bow. In addition to the piers, facilities were available for small craft to operate a ferry service from very large vessels with a draft that precluded their use of the piers. Although it had been used elsewhere and steadily developed over the past 3 years, the amphibious vehicle known as the Duck played a major role in transportation from ship to shore. Wheel and propeller drives could be engaged independently, and despite its ungainly appearance, the Duck was quite maneuverable, both on land or in water. As each installation at Arromanches was brought into operation, the intake handled grew, and by late July it had reached 136,000 tons a week. At its peak, more than 15,000 personnel were manning Mulberry. By the late autumn, the Allies had captured and put into operation sufficient channel ports to be able to dispense with Mulberry, the last major cargoes being unloaded in November. By then, some 250,000 troops and 40,000 vehicles had passed through.
Drove through Caen and on to Falaise, over the Seine, over the Somme, through Lille and into Belgium, on through Brussels and into Holland, to the frontiers of Germany, and on towards Berlin.
How much the secrets of D-Day in their various forms contributed to the overall success of the Normandy campaign is difficult to assess. But what is certain is that their contribution was significant. Significant in assisting the Allied forces to establish and maintain the Normandy bridgehead, and significant in helping to avoid the potentially high casualties of such an undertaking.
It was effective. It saved many days of battle, saved lots and lots of lives, of that I'm sure. I'm very pleased that I was involved.
In spite of what we had done, and what we thought was silly games, I think it did turn out that we did do something to save some lives.
Do you think it saved lives?
Oh yes, many, many lives. Oddly enough, on both sides. And that I used to rejoice in.
Why do you say that?
Well, I don't think war is all just killing. It's gaining ground, objectives, not just killing. I don't think that makes sense. They have to be. I mean, you have to have killing in war. I mean, that's all there's about it. But it's far better to capture an entire force than kill it all. I think.
And bluff can help.
Oh, enormously. It isn't bluff, it's feeding the enemy intelligence. It's up to him. He is prune enough to accept it. There it is.